Hi.
Howdy.
Fact number one, transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychologists Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number two, rich kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor.
It's not true.
Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where you
is there a question mark at the end?
Fact number three, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the three facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number two. Number three, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
Politics become more divisive and messy business, and as a result, arguably the most qualified people aren't running anymore. What would it take for you yourself to run for office? And then, do you think we'll ever get back to a time where those most qualified people want to be in politics and want to?
Well, I mean, there's always been sort of a disconnect between the right and the left in terms of qualified people going into public office. I will get to your first question. There's always been a disconnect because on the left, if you're really smart and qualified, you go into government. And on the right, if you're really smart and qualified, you go create things that help people and make millions of dollars. So what you end up with is this weird disconnect where the people who are on the Republican stage are all of sort of, with a few exceptions, they're all sort of middling IQ and not necessarily the world's greatest and smoothest orators. And on the Democratic side, you have a bunch of people with Ivy League degrees, except for this time around when you have an old crone who is going to be handed anyway. And also a loon bag old socialist who escaped from the asylum. So this time actually bucks the cycle a little bit. And so we end up with a race between the two least qualified candidates in American history. But all that said, what would it take for qualified people to jump in? First of all, people have to learn to love the fight, especially people of our generation. We have to learn to love the fight. Okay, the fight can be fun. This idea that there was ever civility and gentility in politics, not really. There was more kind of on an open level. But the fact is that back in 1800, if you read the scurrilous broadsides being published by the Adams campaign against the Jefferson campaign and back and forth, it was pretty rough stuff. I mean, you had a guy named James Callender, who's actually a muckraker for Thomas Jefferson, writing things about how John Adams was senile and he was running around the White House throwing his wig at people. Really. And meanwhile, you had muckrakers for Adams trying to discredit Alexander Hamilton, who was on Jefferson's side, and bringing up all the issues about him having adulterous affairs and all this. So it's always been a rough business. I think that conservatives have to engage in that, and they have to like it. It's why people embrace Trump. It's because Trump actually comes off as aggressive. For all the problems I personally have with Trump morally, ethically, politically, the one thing that Trump is aggressive. And so it's going to take a new generation of aggressive conservatives. As far as would I ever run for office, I mean, honestly, in this day and age, I'm not sure I'm qualified. I'm not the son or the husband of a former president. So it's a pretty restrictive group of people who are allowed in. And I'm also not one of the Trump children, who I guess are next on the list. So I'll have to blame my father if I never run for office. It's his fault.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. So I believe that the first half of the 21st century will be controlled by identity politics. I think the trend is clear considering we had the first women and orange man win party nominations. I want to know how a person who may not rely on identity politics can effectively make their voice heard over those who do.
Okay, so this is a really great question. I agree that what we've seen is the rise of identity politics on the left, and I think that there's actually a rise of identity politics on the right. It's why you see the rise of the so-called alt-right, which is an identity politics-driven group. The idea that white people need their own sort of political action group. And that's a problem to me. I'm not somebody who believes in identity politics. I think identity politics are actually evil. I don't think that you have your own interest group because of your race or your skin color or your ethnicity or any of that. So the only way to really speak to this is by going back to a message that I think we all chanted tonight, which is decency. Right? It's very easy to get tribal. People are inherently tribal. We all feel more for our families, as I said, than we do for people more broadly around us. The only way that you break that cycle is by having what they call social capital. And the way that social capital is created, the reason that I trust you or that I trust my neighbor to babysit my kids is because I know that my neighbor is a decent person. So if we encourage everyone on an individual level to abide by decency, then you can break the never-ending cycle of identity politics. But that actually requires stuff to happen outside the realm of politics. It requires an upsurge in civic morality. It requires an upsurge in things like people going to church and joining together as communities. It requires a real move toward people talking about how to deal with each other morally on a non-governmental level. If you do all that, you can recreate a social fabric that has been torn apart by identity politics. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Ben, huge fan, first of all. My question for you is pretty simple, and that is the Republican Party the answer for conservatism in America?
So the Republican Party is just a tool, and as we've seen in this election cycle, it's a tool that's available for anyone to take over, right? So sometimes you're going to get a conservative leading the Republican Party, and sometimes you're going to get an ad hoc nationalist populist leading the Republican Party. It's the obligation of people who are conservative like me to try and fight inside the Republican Party to change the leadership if you don't like the leadership, and talk of third parties. Very difficult structurally to put together a third party. If Trump ends up driving the Republican Party far away from conservatism in a very clear and obvious way, you will see some rumblings about a third party because there are too many people who still believe in kind of root traditional conservatism to be thrown off by Trumpism. So it is the tool right now. Will it always be the tool? Not necessarily. The Whig Party was once the tool, presumably, and that fell away too. So things change.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. I have a question for you as a Harvard Law School graduate.
Sure.
Regarding the incident at Camp Randall, the man was asked to take off the quote-unquote noose around his head. Under the Brandenburg test, is this constitutionally able for the police to ask him to take off this rope, or is it considered free speech?
So, I mean, I assume that it's free speech under, the idea that it's not first of all, shouting fire in a crowded theater is based on a case that was Schenck, which has been debunked for 60 years. But yes, I'm not sure what the campus regulations are. There are policies that exist on campus that don't exist anywhere else in American life. And the Supreme Court has approved some of those things because there are time and space constraints. But if it's message specific, then you get into trouble. So it's at the very least, in my legal opinion, it's constitutionally questionable. That doesn't mean that I think it's a great idea or I think that it's a wonderful exercise of freedom of speech, but it is definitely questionable. Anytime there's a free speech question, I tend to lead on the side of free speech. And by the way, folks, if I'm answering to camera, that's only because there are people who are watching on the live stream, and it looks weird if I'm talking out here. So.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you for taking a principled stance, criticizing Trump this election cycle. Thank you for introducing me to Harambe memes.
Well, that's his memory.
Last week, John Oliver used his show as a call to arms to support Planned Parenthood because Republicans have the House, the Senate, the White House. Do you anticipate pushback within the Republican Party if the pro-life movement tries to move forward with its agenda in the next 2 years?
I mean, this is a really good question. I'm not sure how committed Donald Trump is to, for example, reversing funding for Planned Parenthood, right? He said early in the primaries that he liked Planned Parenthood. He thought that they did some good work. It'll be interesting to see if he clashes with the new Congress over that, because clearly Paul Ryan and a lot of other members of Congress would like to withdraw federal funding for Planned Parenthood. Obviously, I think that's a good idea. I think abortion is immoral, and the idea that I'm paying for somebody else's baby to be killed seems pretty ridiculous, morally, ethically, legally to me. I think all of it's really dubious. It is definitely questionable. As far as John Oliver, We have a really bad habit in this country of taking everybody seriously if they have a British accent. And that seems to me a bad mistake. We ought to judge John Oliver by the content of his speech, not the quality thereof.
We've seen.
Thank you, Ben. Huge fan. Would you say it's possible for the left to recognize broken families as one of the biggest problems in American society? And if so, what would it take for the left to realize how big of a problem this is?
Okay, so the left is never going to recognize that broken families are a problem because it is one of the goals of the left to break families. Historically speaking, if you read Marx and Engels, they do not like the traditional family. They think the traditional family is a bulwark against an overarching brutal state. Right, so the idea is, and they want the overarching brutal state, so therefore they don't want the family. The family is a bunch of people who care about each other more than they care about the community at large. And so this is why in Soviet Russia, the chief goal was to separate children from their family, have them turn on their parents. I mean, some of the great Soviet heroes in the Soviet Union were kids who reported their parents to the authorities. Right, so the left has never been in favor of traditional families. They see it as a threat. Because traditional families don't vote according to how the left wants them to vote. They vote in favor of leave me alone. I've got my family. It's my job to protect them. So the left is never going to stand up in favor of that to the detriment of everybody involved. And therefore, it's incumbent on particularly religious people, because religion still has a significant amount of weight in American life, unlike in Europe. It's incumbent on religious people to make sure that their kids understand the value of family. It's incumbent on secular thinkers to make clear to people that broken homes, that single motherhood is not an affirmative good. And when Hollywood tells these lies, a great book by Charles Murray it's called Coming Apart, and it's actually about white poor people, white poverty versus white wealth. And he says one of the problems is a lot of people who exist in the white wealthy sphere, people in Hollywood, they live like traditionally religious people, but they preach like far leftists. So they'll be married, they'll have kids, they'll have the same divorce rate as kind of normal folks, but then they'll preach that all families are created equal. And look, this is not to say there can't be great single moms. There can. It's not to say there can't be crappy two-parent homes. Of course there can. But on a general level, if you are born into a two-parent family, you do have an advantage over people who are born into a one-parent family. It is everybody in this room's responsibility to live out these ideals, teach them to your kids, and teach them to all the people around you, regardless of race. Okay, and I understand there are people. I spoke at a school called Otay Ranch High School in San Diego, and it's a largely low-income minority crowd. I don't know how the public school approved it, but they did. And so I was speaking to them, and at one point I said exactly what I've said here. Single motherhood is a predictor of poverty, and if you're impoverished for all of your adult life in the United States, it's because you're not good with money. It's because you make bad decisions with your money. And the principal actually walked down and shut down the speech and excused the entire class if they wanted to leave, because he said there are too many kids here who are products of single mothers, and they might be offended. Okay, if you can't tell people the truth because they might be offended, we're never going to get anywhere here. So we have to tell people the truth regardless of whether it offends them.